Welcome to XML. Our lecture today is a kind of a flipped classroom approach plus. So I will go rather quickly through the slides which we provided to you already, and then we will go into a discussion for question and answering and sharing some of the thoughts that you have. So first of all, the introduction to XML. XML, the M in XML stands for markup, and that is the most important term that we will use here, or that we address here in the lecture. And as a homework, I hope those of you who haven't done so, you should take a look into the World Wide Web Consortium website at w3.org/markup to just read about the introduction that the W3C provides on the topic of markup. We also had the quick discussion about that during the tutorials, so I will not go into detail here. I will just want to make sure that markup is something that has evolved over time, starting with the term tag by Stanley Rice in the context of book design and editorial structures. So in the early days of publishing books, people had to tag to create some extra notes in the context of the text that they want to publish, in the context of the book text that they want to publish. So they had to make sure that the publisher knows what is a headline, what is normal text, what kind of text should be written in another form. And over time, people started to make this kind of tags or this markup that they used, these special notes. They wanted to form this into a kind of a markup language, or a tag language, if you like. And this evolved also in the context of creating this kind of tag language in a more systematic way. And one of these examples which evolved over time is the hypertext markup language, HTML, the lingua franca of the web, the language that allows us to create web pages, to create text with tags, with special markup that not the book publisher, but now the browser knows how to render and how to display. And here is a very simple example, which has some content, like water, €1, beer, 150, wine, 150, and markup, HTML markup to be more precise. And the product or the production of this rendering is shown in the window on the right. A little bit change of the same content, but changing the markup changes the table on the right. So this is hopefully already very clear to everyone. But it's interesting to see that that this markup idea of the early days for marking up or tagging text in the context of book printing, or text in the context of web page rendering in the browser, or printing on screen by the browser, has some advantages and disadvantages, like as usual. And the advantages that we have are very obvious. We have a markup that is very simple, and therefore can be implemented by all kinds of browsers, which in the end became also a business issue, the browser war, who develops the best browser and who owns in that context the community, from a business point of view, and also a lot of disadvantages that HTML provides. For instance, the processing that we will see later on is very difficult, and sometimes even the semantics of these tags, which we put on the text, on the context, on the content, is unclear, and only from the let's say visual point of view might be clear, but from the interpretation point of view, from the real meaning point of view, there are examples that are really unclear and therefore difficult if we want to use HTML, for instance, not only to display content, but also to move content from one computer to another in the context of exchanging data. So this flexibility problem is an issue with HTML. And if we go back into the early days of these printing context, of the book printing context, in the late 60s, IBM created a so-called GML, the generalized markup language, and the GML was the first approach in that context, let's say approach that became relevant. That was an approach to have a markup language to describe other markup languages. Yeah, and that became an ISO standard in 1986, the so-called SGML standard. And the problem with SGML is it is super complex. Yeah, so it's very powerful, but it's also so complex that it is difficult to apply for everyday problems. Yeah, so and the everyday problem is I want to move data from one computer to another computer so that the other computer understands the meaning of my data. So, and here we are. The W3C's recommendation, Extensible Markup Language, XML, which is the main topic of this lecture. XML is a simple meta-language for markup language definition. Or in other words, it's like SGML, the super complex approach from the ISO, compared to the, let's say, limited but very simple and very applicable approach for creating structured documents of data. Yeah, so HTML, XML, often people misunderstand both meanings. HTML is a markup language for hypertext documents that are where the main idea is that the content is rendered by a browser. These are the typical web pages that we use every day. While XML is a format to create data structures which we can use to create data documents that we can move from one computer to another computer so that the other computer can make use and process the XML document or the XML application. It's a document using the XML for describing the data structure and can process this data, understanding the meaning, understanding the rules, process also in the way that the other computer might even check if the data is correct or not, based on the grammatic, the grammar that we describe in this context of the data. That's it. That's the main difference. And now the tricky thing is there are many applications of this extensible markup language, many data structures that were described and defined by using XML. For instance, the SVG format. SVG is a format for graphics. XML EDI is a format for e-commerce documents described as XML application. And to make one thing very confusing, there is even a XML structure called XHTML, an XML application called XHTML that uses XML not for primary data transport mechanisms, but for having a format like HTML, but now using the clear rules of the XML grammar that they describe in as XHTML. And the documents that are described in XHTML look like HTML documents, but they are conforming to the rules of the extensible markup language, and they are not defined as documents for exchanging data, but for documents that can be rendered by a browser. So that's why a lot of people get confused also in books and postings on the web. Is XML, XHTML, and HTML, what are the differences? Well, XHTML is more or less HTML described by using XML, while HTML is described using SGML. And we will see why XHTML might be the better approach. But most importantly, we will see what XML is all can do for us. Like, for instance, to have the last example also mentioned, RSS, really simple syndication, RSS feeds. Many of you use them in the context of podcasts, for instance. The list of podcasts are often described as RSS format, which is an application of the XML. So I don't go into the history of XML because that's what I already mentioned in some context. When we are talking about XML, we are talking about not only one specific recommendation or standard. We are usually talking about a full family of specifications. Just to give you a very glimpse overview here, when we are talking about this family of specifications, we are talking about XML 1.0. That's the core XML specification, which uses already other specifications like Unicode and the concept of the URI or HTTP, HTTPS URIs, and then we will also usually use namespaces and other formats which are all under the umbrella term of XML usually. Yeah, for instance, XSLT, XPath, XLink, XML schema, and a lot of other terms that we will learn, XML ID, for instance. They all belong to this very broad specification, which is usually named just XML. And we will see how all these different specifications belong together and benefit from each other. So an XML example is very, very simple. It looks very similar to an HTML page, but instead of starting with descriptions of the HTML document, we will see here a starting point of the XML document, some hint. We will learn what these hints are named in the end. Some hints for the reading processor, that the following characters should be interpreted as XML based on version 1.0. And now you see here, similar to an HTML document with tags, you see here the XML document with tags that we can define on our own. And what you also see here is that an XML document is very clearly and simple structured. It always defines a tree, so a element with sub-elements, like this one here. This element order has a sub-element item and yet another one item and yet another one called order date. And we are the authors of these element names. So we can describe the element names in a way that we like, and we will see how these element names that we describe on our own can also be part of a grammar, so that everyone can check if the element names are written correctly and used correctly in the way that the author of this grammar intended these elements to be used. We also see that an element has or can have attributes like this one here, order ID. And an order ID attribute has a value like this one here. We see here that there might be different attributes. Elements can be open or can be closed like this one here. This form you will not find in an HTML document. It's a shortcut for a closed element, so an element that has no content except maybe an attribute or attributes in it. And here you see an element like price, which has some content in it, some value here, characters 248.00 space EUR as characters. So that's it. That's XML, and congratulations to everyone. You are now knowledgeable in writing XML documents because you can simply create your own element names the way you like. The only thing that you have to do is you have to take care that every attribute has to be written in this format. So there is no other format allowed, like for instance in HTML. And an element must be closed, like item, close item. Room, this is already closed by the slash at the end of the tag, and that's it. That's it more or less. The very simple rules that come with XML. So when we apply these very simple rules, then we are talking about a document. When we are talking about a document that applies exactly these very simple rules, that all elements are closed, like tag and end tag, what I already mentioned. We might have empty elements, and we quote all the attributes. Then we are speaking about a well-formed document. And that's the most important thing. You have to write well-formed documents. And a well-formed document can already benefit everyone who uses these well-formed documents, because a well-formed document can be very easily used by dedicated XML libraries or components to read a well-formed document. We can even improve the usage of a well-formed document by making it even a valid XML document. And a valid XML document is not only well-formed, it also lies and is correct in the sense of it adheres to the document type definition or schema, in other words, to a grammar, which we defined either as a document type definition or as a schema. Yeah, so we will learn throughout the semester the two different ways of describing a grammar. The very simple one, DTD, the document type definition approach, and the schema approach. If we have a valid XML document, we can create the rules, the grammar, in form of a document type definition document or in form of a schema document, and provide this grammar document, these rules document, to our communication partners. So whenever everyone has access to these ruled or grammar documents, we can then simply exchange data which is tagged or advanced in the context of this specific tags which are defined by the grammar. And if the XML document which contains our data is well formed and valid in the context of the specific grammar document, we can be very clear in the context of exchanging data, because then everyone who exchanges data with each other knows that the data that is exchanged is valid due to the possibility that we can automatically check by a software, by some algorithms, if the data that we receive is correct in the sense of the rules that are defined in a document type definition or schema document. Okay, so let's talk about some of these schema or document type definitions, these grammars. And of course, we will talk about first of all about the two types of possibilities to specify grammars. There are others as well, but here we will focus on the two main ones: XML document type definitions and schemas. We will also talk about, in the next couple of chapters, about some very specific additional specifications of the W3C on additions or additional rules for advancing typically the schemas grammar in the context of inheritance, in the context of transformation, addressing, linking, those kinds of things. So these are called the XML basics. And as you can see here, the transformation, for instance, the XSLT, is such a standard from the W3C for transforming XML documents from one document into another document. And that is described again as an XML application, applying the rules of a dedicated schema, of a specific grammar, which describes which terms or which tag names we can use in the context of transforming documents. And we will see a couple of other things in this context called the XML basics. These are the basic skills that you have to understand to create powerful grammars on your own, and also to understand all the different XML applications or XML grammars that are already out there. Yeah, so for instance, there's a grammar called MarsML. I talked about RSS, SVG already. MarsML, as the name already suggests, is a markup language for describing mathematical formulas. We will also talk about a XML grammar called RDF, which allows to describe semantic, so facts in the end. And we will also talk about the tools that make it possible to create those kinds of grammars and use them, and also, let's say, play with them in the context of testing them, validating them, creating databases in these contexts, and so on and so forth. We will also use and make a deeper look into some very specific user experience related XML grammars like the XSL FO and XForms and sitemaps. Those kinds of XML grammars allow to create user interface related aspects like forms, or navigational aspects like sitemaps. We will also take a look into XHTML, which I already mentioned, and other languages related to the user interface. For instance, also voice interfaces like voice XML allows to specify. In addition, we will also touch slightly some of the grammars which are related to service-oriented programming and the service-oriented computing paradigm in the context of SOAP, for instance, and WSDL and Beeple and those kinds of things, which are used by services like Amazon, for instance, for creating their Amazon Web Services infrastructure and also other infrastructures from Google, Microsoft, etc. That brings me to the first chapter, chapter 3, which focuses on XML documents and the basics in that context. So the XML 1.0 specification is a W3C recommendation from the late 90s. And from my point of view, it's a must to take a look into it, even though it's probably really, really challenging in the early beginning to read about this specification and the details. But as I said, you need to have some training on reading these kinds of specifications. So take some time, probably some tea, some coffee next to it, maybe also something that pushes you up, like chocolate or green tea or whatever. But take the time and read into these specific recommendations, the early ones, not the latest ones, the early ones, as mentioned earlier. So just that you get a deeper look into it. And even if it's very difficult to understand, try to get and try to train your brain and your eyes to really understand the structure of these documents. The function of the markup in an XML document is to describe its storage and logical structure and to associate attribute value pairs with its logical structures. XML provides a mechanism, the document type declaration, to define constraints on the logical structure and to support the use of predefined storage units. That is something that you will read in this specification, in this recommendation from February 10 in 1998. And that describes already very well what we will see in this specification, namely a lot of very specific markup elements that that just have the task or the intention to, or the goal, if you like, the goal to define these associations and structures just around content. So we have a couple of these kinds of things, and you will see all of them, of course, and if you look into the specification. Here we will only focus on the most relevant ones, and that is elements and attributes. So elements defines a logical structure. News, date, descriptions, these are the elements. Or to be more precise, the element names. The element itself starts here with less than and greater than characters. But this full character sequence with the date name of the element is the starting element, and here you have the closing element of the element date. And in between, you see there's some content. You see here in the description element, there is also an attribute called headline, and as you can see, this is well formed because it's written according to the rules of the XML specification. What you also see is the XML declaration at the early beginning of the document, that one here, this line, which describes how the parser should interpret the rest of the following text lines and the text encoding and which version of XML should be used. So these three, if you understand these three, then you are already on a very, very good way, not only to write XML documents in a well-formed way, but also to create meaning in the sense of creating a grammar which describes which elements and attributes are allowed in your XML documents. So when we are talking about an element might be an empty element, which we see here. This one, leer, or that's the German term. Yeah, in English you would say maybe empty. Whatever the name of this element is, it is an empty element. There is no content in between. Therefore, a lot of people just write this short form of an empty element. So that is one kind of element, one type of element, the so-called element with an empty content model. An element might have also an unstructured or structured or mixed content model. The content model unstructured means, okay, between the opening element name and the closing element name, there is character data. So you might have this very specific character sequence, or you might have just these kinds of characters, just normal characters. But if you want to have all kinds of character data, so including these specific characters like greater signs or smaller, less than signs, greater than or less than signs, characters, which are usually elements or characters for starting or telling the interpreter, telling the parser to switch the mode in understanding the characters that now a element comes, will be passed. So if you want to tell the parser that the parser should not interpret these characters, we can tell the parser that there is now a sequence of character data coming, and it will end when we are providing these stop information. So that is, in the early beginning of learning XML, the most complex character sequence that you have to learn, and over time it becomes very normal, even though it looks a little bit strange. So, unstructured character data model. Here you have also a structured content model. So an element which has only other element as content, as subcontent, if you like. So here we have the element named strukturiert, which has some content, but this content is not character data. This content is an element. So here we see this element called unterelement and yet another unterelement and maybe others. At some point in time, there might even be character data. But the most important thing is that the content of strukturiert of this element is yet another element. And mixed content, if you want to describe an element that might have both character data and element, that is also possible in XML. So these four content models are possible when you are creating or defining an element with a start and an end and a name. Now here you have the name gemischt, and some content model, which might be character data, structured data, mixed character and structured data, or it might be also just an empty element. So how do we describe an attribute? So here you see an element with an attribute, another attribute, and yet another attribute. So in XML, our elements might have one or more attributes. And what is an attribute? It is a very simple thing. It is a value, a name value pair, which is attached to the element where this attribute is written to in the context of this less and greater than signs characters. Yeah. So if you put this name value pair into this context of this element, you create an attribute attached to this element. And it is your freedom and your power, if you like, as the author of the XML document, to define if you want to have this value Wert either as part of the content model of the element. Yeah. So for instance, you might say, no, I want to have this Wert here, this value. I want to have this as part of an unstructured content model. Or you might say, no, I want to have this value added to this element as an attribute. Yeah, here this attribute has a name Attribut, this attribute has a name Sprache, and this attribute has a name Datum. And there are good reasons for having attributes, so putting the value into the context of an attribute, or putting the value into the context of the content model. Both might be okay, both might be good. In the end, the most important thing is it's up to the author, and we will see which of these two decisions make more or less sense. XML declaration. Well, the XML declaration, as I said, is important for the XML processor, the parsing algorithm that reads the document and needs to interpret the data that is or the characters that the parser reads. Here we will just keep it very simple. If you take a look into the specification and also into the tutorials, we will go deeper into what you can do with it. Most importantly is that you define which XML version we are applying. Typically, that's 1.0, and how the text is encoded. That's typically UTF-8, but it might also be Japanese codes or whatever other encoding you would like. We will also talk about standalone, yes or no, and other attributes here later on. So, some rules for well-formedness on top of the ones that I already mentioned. There are very, very few ones that you have to take into account. But those few that are important, let's talk about them here, because they are so simple, we can put them onto one page. First of all, if you start a tag, it needs to be ended in the correct way. That means a start tag needs an end tag, and in between there might be some content model applied, but you cannot mix the end of the content model with the actual end tag. So what I mean is, when I write parent and I have a structured content model, and part of the structured content model might be the element child, then I can write child, I have to close child, and then I can and have to close the starting element, which is end parent here. It would be wrong to write parent child and parent and child. This is possible in HTML, and the browser will usually render that code correctly, but in XML it would be wrong. And that means the document would be not well formed, and you would get an error by the XML processor, which parses the XML document. An empty tag or an element with an empty content model must be closed with an end tag in the way that we already mentioned. And then there are some exceptions regarding namings of elements. So a name of an element must start with a letter or with an underscore, and it can contain numbers, but it cannot contain, for instance, colon or equals character. or it cannot start with these three letters XML, because that are exceptions used for new standards and dedicated aspects in the context of creating, just additional rules for the markup language itself. There is something which is called white space. White space in text is taken into account. If you are an expert in reading XML documents, and most importantly, also in reading the XML grammars, like a document type definition or a schema, and especially the W3C specifications, you will learn that the letter S has a specific meaning in these specifications, and it stands for space. So take this into account. Some of the terminology in these specifications is always the same, so it makes reading a lot easier. But you have to learn which letter, which name, which thing has what meaning, and then you will get a lot faster in understanding those specifications. Attribute names in elements are always unique. That is maybe also an important thing to keep in mind. So that is more or less the most important aspects of XML 1.0, of that kind of specification. And then we also see in the context of XML also very often the term namespace. So the namespace is a very important concept, which we will see, and its power we will really feel very soon in a couple of other specifications. So here I will just briefly talk about what a namespace is. So let's think about, we have two documents, a book document and a person document. In our book document, we write about books, and we think a book has a title and a book has a chapter, or a couple of chapters. So we define a book as the first element in an XML document is called the root element. So our root element might be book, and then followed by an element called title, and then followed by yet a couple of other elements called chapters. In the same context, we might create a person document, a person database, our contact database, for instance. And we might think, okay, let's write down first name, last name. And as we are talking about maybe our colleagues and friends, a couple of them might be from university, others might be from other communities, like from the UK, where we have a king. And then there might be a friend of you might be a professor, yet another friend of you might be a doctor. They all have a first name and a last name. Some might not have a first name, only a last name, depending on the culture. But some of them might have a title. So if we are talking about these two documents, these two XML documents, and we are focusing just on one of them, that's totally fine. But what if we want to bring the two books, the two documents together? So maybe one of your friends is a book author. So Dr. Mia Meyer, she might be a book author. So when we bring these two things together, the title of the book plus the book author, then in our XML document, which would be a list of book titles and their authors, then we would have a problem. So what title element belongs to the book and what title element belongs to the person? In XML, we would just write title and everything would be fine. But we could not differentiate the meaning of the one title with the meaning of the other title. And if we want to put some meaning to these elements, then we can do this with a namespace. The namespace would say, okay, here, this is the namespace of books. And here we would use title belongs to the namespace of person. And having these namespaces defined in the context of these elements, in the context of the elements for the grammar to describe our books or our persons, then we can differentiate the meaning of title either belonging to book or belonging to person. So how is this done? Well, the namespace concept is implemented very simple. We create a namespace and give that namespace a name. So for instance, book. And here we have the namespace person. And we add this namespace at the beginning and the namespace name with a colon and then the element. Yeah, so instead of writing title, we could say book colon title and person colon title. And then we have just to define, okay, what is book and what is person, and how can we describe these two names or these two variable names in a way that it is very clear that book and person is also different. And to do so, there is a namespace recommendation or namespace concept, if you like, and it says that a namespace is represented by a URI, so by an address, a HTTP address, for instance. So we could say there is http://example.org/book, and we would say, okay, this URL is called book, and we might have https://vsr.informatik.tuchemnitz.de/people grammar, and we would say, okay, this URL is called person. So we could easily define these two namespaces and then use these two namespaces to differentiate the similar names for completely different elements with the name title. So here you see how this might look like. We could define in the root element or in other elements as an attribute a namespace. Yeah, so we could say NS1, NS2, these are two namespaces. Here we have an HTTP URI, here we have an URN URI, and then we could say NS1 colon title, NS2 colon title, and using these two different namespaces, we can then differentiate the two element names. I won't get into detail here. The URI should be well known by each of us. It is an RFC and also not only an IETF standard, but also a standard that is relevant in the context of the URI recommendation. So you can read about this standard at the IETF and also at the W3C. And this should be clear how it works, and therefore I don't get into more detail here. The most important thing is that we can use and create namespaces in or declare these namespaces by using a specific character sequence called XMLNS. That is the XML namespace declaration. So if I want to declare a namespace, I must make sure that the author of an XML document understands that this NS1 is not simply an attribute, but it is a namespace as an attribute. Yeah? So that's why we have to use the term XMLNS, which is the specification part for declaring namespaces. And then we can declare a couple of namespaces which we want to use. So here you see, here's namespace 1 called example.org/text document, and here ns2 URN schema person. So we have two namespaces, and we can now differentiate the title in the one grammar described by this namespace and in the other grammar described by this namespace. Yeah, so ns1 and ns2. If we do not want to write always ns1, ns2 because it's too time consuming or for whatever reason, we could also say we use a standard namespace which is always in place when we do not use any kind of namespace like this one here. Yeah? Element, the question is, okay, element belongs to which kind of namespace? A namespace is also declaring a set of elements. Yeah? So here, this element belongs to the standard namespace, and the standard namespace can be created by using just the term XMLNS, but no differentiating additional sequence of character like this one here. And this would be then the standard namespace. So, and whatever you write here is the standard namespace. Here's a question in the chat. Can the namespace also be declared in elements other than the root element? Yes, this can be done, and we will talk about this, what that means, and if this makes sense, or how you have to be careful in that context later on. All right, so go into the next context. Authoring tools. Very obvious. The most important thing about XML is not only that it is powerful in the context of well-formed and valid documents, but it is also powerful in the context of its simplicity. Yeah, so it's very easy to create XML documents because you only need to have a text editor, and simply Notepad, Emacs, whatever text editor you use. It is super simple to create an XML document, and there's no excuse that you cannot do so. Of course, a text editor such as Emacs or Notepad is not very powerful in that context because it does not explicitly support what XML also transports from the meaning point of view, from the validity point of view, from the well-formedness point of view. So therefore, there are dedicated editors that take the specifics of XML into account, and these ones we will call XML editors. So editors that are specifically designed to write or process XML data. So there are also a couple of them, and we will show you some and the benefits. More interestingly, there are also domain-specific XML editors that maybe you as the author don't even see that you're writing XML code, because it's domain-specific. So that means there might be an editor that asks the author or the user of the editor for filling out certain forms, and the form is then saved or stored as a file using some specific XML elements, some specific grammar, and therefore we call these kinds of editors domain-specific XML editors. So examples for XML editors of all kinds. Here you see some old Visual Studio version. Here the XML Notepad from Windows. There is XML Spy, very kind of expensive tool which has support for all kinds of special XML applications. Here you see support for XML, support for document type definition schema, XSL, XQuery, and those kinds of things. Okay, so let's talk about, now that we are knowledgeable and experts of how to write an XML document, how to write elements in a way that they are well-formed, and even knowledgeable about the semantics of these kinds of elements. Now let's talk about how can we create grammars so that we can really enforce the validity of an XML document. So just to have a very simple example here, let's talk about an XML document about news. So maybe we want to put news into an XML document. To make clear that we are talking about news, we say that the so-called root element is called news. And the news element has a structured content model. And that content model should have only items as sub-elements. So a news element, the new root element, is providing the starting point for sub-elements called item. And an item is a news entry. A news item contains two elements. Let's say it contains two elements, a date element and the news, the actual news entry, the description of what we want to describe. And of course, the description of what we want to describe requires a headline. And to make sure that this headline is very specific, we define and decide that we do not want to have a headline element, but just want to have a headline attribute where we put the headline in. Very simple, right? So that's it. That's our XML document. As you can see in this example, it's well formed. It has news, item, date, description as elements, and the headline attribute. So that's it. If we want to make clear that everyone has to follow exactly this kind of structure and apply these rules that we define. So for instance, the rule that we want to have a headline attribute and not a headline element, how can we specify that and make sure that everyone who, let's say, belongs to our news organization creates news documents where the headline is a headline attribute? So to do so, we need to have a grammar. And as a grammar, we are starting with the document type definition. So what is a document type definition? First of all, it is something that you will find as a specification in the W3C's set of specification documents, of all their recommendations. So again, homework, if you haven't done so, go there, find that document type declaration, document type definition documents, and start reading them. So these two terms, document type declaration and document type definition, are very important. The document type declaration contains or points to markup declarations that provides a grammar for a class of documents. So this grammar is known as document type definition. The document type definition is a set of markup declarations included in or referenced by an XML document. Sounds complicated. It's not that complicated. So let's take a look. How does an XML document look like? Well, it starts with the declaration, which we already saw, this XML, and then the version, and so on and so forth. There might be also other elements like comments and stuff, which you will find in the specification of XML version 1.0, but we don't take a deeper look into these kinds of things. After that XML declaration, the document declaration, there might be a document type definition. The document type definition is a set of specific writings that describe elements, attributes, or other entities, as well as external document type definitions. So we can also reference document type definitions that are written in other documents so that we can reuse a document type definition, a grammar, from another, described in another document. But most importantly, especially if you want to learn XML, it's good to know that you can put the document type definition as part of the so-called prologue and the document content, the application of your document type definition, all together into one XML document and play with it. And we have provided some support for playing with it in Opal in case you haven't seen that already. So the prologue contains the declaration and the document type definition, and the document content is starting with the root element and then followed by, depending on what the document type definition says. Here's a question in the chat. Maybe you already announced it, but why is in the doc declaration a question mark? Well, I haven't announced that, and that's a good question actually. Why do they use question mark here? Well, just to make it easier for the parser writer to understand, okay, this sequence, a less than character and a question mark character in the first couple of lines of the document, is different compared to the root element, which is just a less than character and then underscore or some normal characters from the alphabet. So it's just to make writing the parser, the text parser, a little bit easier. But those kinds of different writings, yeah, that's part of our, let's say, as a student, I would say as a part of my emotional state, yeah, to make me crazy, like the character data sequence, which I showed you earlier. Those kinds of things we just have to learn. It's part of the definitions on how things are written. So this page is looking awful, but it's in here for a good reason, because I just want those of you who haven't taken a look into the standards that they cannot run away from looking and watching and reading these kinds of specifications that we usually only see if you look into the recommendations or the specifications from the W3C. And so in this W3C recommendation about the document type declaration, you will see this form of specifications. Yeah? So here is the S, the white space. I haven't described white space here, so you will find how white space is defined in the Bacchus Now form at these kinds of specifications. Here you see that the document type declaration contains an XML declaration, one or none, zero or many MISC content elements, or whatever you want to call these, and then the doc type declaration, and again MISC. So what is MISC? It's comments or process instructions or white space. What is XML decl? It's the first line which we had already seen. It's the question mark, this specific text or character sequence that says, okay, here is that is the character sequence. This is how the character sequence has to look like. This is written in the specification. This is part of the standard, that the declaration has to start with smaller than signs, the question marks, the XML characters here, these three letters, and then followed by a version info and some encoding declaration and some other declarations as well. Yeah. So these kinds of things, of writings, of specifications, we will see in many of these W3C documents, and this is what I want you really to train reading. Do the training, try to prepare your eyes for this kind of text on a page. I know it hurts, it doesn't look nice, it doesn't read nice, it also doesn't feel nice, but the better you get used to it, the better your chances improve in the context of being faster in learning, reading these things, and which sums up in the context of being simply better than others. As I said, regarding this declaration, the comment looks like this one here, smaller than or less than character, and then this specific sequence of letters or characters that the parser identifies as a comment. And it's closed by minus greater than characters. And these three characters tell the parser that the sequence of characters which should not be interpreted are ending now, and from now on the parser should interpret the next characters also in the context of normal XML. Yeah, so and here you see the parser reads the smaller than sign character, and then the R character, the O, the T, and greater than character, and these character are then identified as an element because of the structure here, and the in between this character sequence ROOT is then interpreted as an element name called root. So there must be some content, might be an empty element, but here you see there is some comment in between and nothing else. So this root element has no real content in between, might be an empty element. So comments are, like in programming languages, are also possible to be used in the context of creating XML comments, which might be useful when you're designing your examples for working on creating your own specific XML application or XML standard, if you like. And so therefore, that is very helpful. So let's talk about the doc type. The document type definition specifies the doc type, and that doc type is either a reference to a grammar, to an external grammar, that would be written in this context. So you have a very specific sequence of characters telling that there is a grammar called news, and the news grammar can be found at this URL, example.org/newsdtd. Again, the doc type, the document type definition is specified in this way. If you look into the recommendations from the W3C, and as you can see here, the doc type declaration is either an external one, or it describes a set of markup declaration and declaration separators. So the markup declarations are defined here. Might be an element declaration, an attribute list declaration, an entity declaration, a notation declaration, a process information instruction, or a comment. We saw already how the comment is written. We saw already how elements and attributes are written. So we will not go into detail regarding entities and the other notations, but let's talk about element type declaration and attribute list declaration. So how can we specify in a grammar that a certain element should exist or must exist in our well-formed and valid documents. So, and here we see how this is described in the specification in the W3C's context. And that's, again, I have put this slide here, even though it doesn't look nice. This is, again, for a reason. It is exactly, more or less exactly the way how they specify it in the specification. So please take a look into the specification, download the specification, don't print it, keep it on the screen, and do the eye training and brain training with these specifications. So element, just as a helping point, smaller than less than a character, and so on and so on. The element, the S part, the name, the S part, content minus specification greater than. That sequence of characters or variables is how we can declare our own element with the name. So we have to write element, then there comes some space, some space characters between the element and our name, maybe one or many. And then we have our name that we write down. That is our element name that we want to use. And then we have to define the content model, by telling the parser that wants to understand the grammar, what content specification, what content model we use. So we use any content, empty content, mixed content, or certain children content. Mixed content might be text and or sub-elements. Children might be a sequence of certain sub-elements. And we will see how these sub-elements look like. There might be sequences or choices and so on and so forth. So let's move on. Otherwise, it might hurt too much. And let's look into just one example. So here we have an element specification, or the declaration of an element called elim. Is the name of our element, and after elim as our element name, we have the content specification starting with an character like this. So we have a mixed content specification. So the mixed content specification here comes with 0 or many item elements, 1 date element, then 0 or 1 name element. Okay, so we could write something like item, comma, date, comma, name. Of course, now we have to specify what the element item looks like, what the element date looks like, and what the element name looks like. So maybe there should be an attribute or whatever. And of course, these elements have to be closed to be valid. So we have to specify also what kind of content model item has, date has, name has. Here's another thing for the computer scientist here who like recursion. So we can create and declare an element recursion with the name recursion, which has either, it's a choice, either after recursion we have the element item, or we have the element recursion, comma, thing. So you see here the root element is recursion. And then we decided on, again, using recursion. And at the end of recursion, we have thing. And inside of recursion, we used recursion ending with thing. And here inside of this recursion, we used the element item and that ends the recursion of our specific declaration here. So you see there is a lot of things possible, but there are also a lot of limitations that cannot be easily done by the way the type declaration allows us to specify certain grammatical rules on our elements. Let's quickly talk about the attribute declaration. An attribute declaration is, or attribute list is written in a way that we specify, first of all, this catchphrase for the parser called @list, and then some white space, and then we write down the name of the element that should have these attributes, and then we define the attribute name and the attribute rules, or the attribute type, if you like. So the name is the element, and @def defines the name and type of the name value pair. So types that we can use for attributes might be either character data, so just a string. It might be an identifier or a reference to an identifier or identifier references, and a couple of other specific types like entity, entities, name token, or name tokens. Each of these attributes might have a very specific characteristic, like the attribute might be required, or it might be given implied or with a fixed value. So let's take a look into how that might look like. So for instance, we have an element called elem name, and we want to have that elem name comes with an attribute, and this attribute might be called my enum type. So that's the attribute name, and we can say this is the value of this my enum type attribute might either be a true, a false, or don't know. So we have three values that we can specify, three tokens that we can specify here, and we can also say that true is a default value. So elem name my enum type don't know would be an override of the true value when we specify the name, the element name with the name elem name. Here we have an attribute for the element with the name elem1. The attribute is called @to, and it is a string attribute with character data, and it is required. So we can write the element elem1, and we have to add the attribute @to because it's required, and the value of @to must be character data, so we can write some text here, some string here, and that's it. It's also important and helpful to create identifiers inside of your XML document, so that you can say, hey, look, this is an attribute which I use here in the context of elem2, and I call this attribute key, and it is an identifier. And this identifier means that the attribute name here, key, must have a value which is unique. So we can use the key A, and we can use the key A in another element, and as these two attributes are of type identifier, not of type character data, but of type identifier, these two must be unique, and the parser would say the document is not valid because one of the attributes is double. So we would have to change either this attribute value here or that one here, let's say to A2 or to B, for instance. Can attribute 2 also have an empty string? Yes, can also be an empty string, but it's required to have that. Attributes of special kinds like XML ID, which we have here is a specific identifier that is used for describing identifiers in the context of XML specifications. So this XML ID recommendation is used especially in special specifications for describing identifiers where we need an identifier from the recommendation, from the grammar point of view, from the specification of the grammar, from the XML, from the W3C's point of view. So there are grammars like SOAP, for instance, that use identifiers, and to have their own kind of identifier, there is the XML ID, which we, of course, using the namespace XML is not allowed for us. It's only being allowed for specification purposes. So if you want to use an ID on top of whatever grammar we are working with, we can use this XML ID specification or recommendation from 2005. Yes, so that's it, more or less, for today. So just to give you a example as at the end of today's session here. So here you have a full XML document with prologue and content. You see here the first line is the XML declaration. And then instead of a reference to a grammar document, we have the document type definition, the grammar implicitly here written as part of the XML specification. And then later on, the full document. So we have the news element specified, the item element specified, the date element specified, the description element specified, and the headline attribute of the description element specified. So having that is a very, very good starting point and a highly recommended to do for everyone here to either copy it and type it into your own XML tool, your own XML, which can handle these kinds of documents, or go to our Opal website and take a look into our internal resources that we provide, where you can also put in these data and create a check of the document type definition in the context of the data provided here. And then, of course, have some fun with the data by changing it and taking a look into the error messages, or maybe improving the grammar and taking a look into how the XML document must be rewritten. But please have some fun with it and use it, and just enjoy playing with the document type definition context here. Having some fun with it is highly important, because the earlier you get used to these two things, the document type definition and the XML content, the further you do so, the easier it gets over time. And I can only recommend you from my own experience, because it took me quite a while to really understand all these things like document type definitions and how XML is written and so on. It's not that difficult. It's actually fairly easy, but it requires some training. Thanks for sharing that. Is it correct? Go to Opal and use what we provide there, and the computer will tell you if it's correct or not. Okay. So that's a very good starting point. It's just as easy as that. The most important thing is, which I can only recommend from my own experience, just start and try a little bit out and try to play with the different types of attributes, and let the computer tell you if what you have written down is correct or not. And that's the easiest way to get used to it, to learn the different sequences of writing elements and attribute lists and so on, because we later use this also, of course, in the exams and in the tutorials. And from my point of view, it's the most simple thing to learn, because the computer will really tell you exactly which line you have the mistake, or in which column you have a wrong character written. So just try and play with it. Just go into Opal and check it out, or ask our teaching assistant. But they will probably tell you, just take a look into the menu structure. We have something provided there as well. That's it for today. Now I will stop the recording